Hey yo everyone, gather round. It's story time. Brought to you by the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Department of Social Work, and a Conscious Party Productions. You are listening to The Critical Social Worker, a revolutionary storytelling podcast.
A conscious party.
Revolutionizing our minds.
Elevating our consciousness.
Changing our worlds.
Your story.
My story.
Our story.
All right. Welcome to another episode of The Critical Social Worker, a revolutionary storytelling podcast. I can't believe it, but this is episode number 45, just at the 1-year anniversary. So we've been working hard putting these episodes out. And I'm very happy to be joined by my old friend and mentor, Dr. Benjamin Lukey. Some people call him Ben, some people call him Dr. Ben. How are you this morning?
I'm doing really well. It's a good Monday morning here in Hawaii.
Yeah. So Dr. Ben is professor of philosophy at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And then I actually have something funny here, is that I've been involved with the academy several times, but I never really learned how to pronounce it. And when I was looking on the website, I was like, I think I've been pronouncing it wrong based on the spelling. So you have to tell us.
Sure. So I am the associate director of the University of Hawaii at Manoa Uehiro Academy for philosophy and ethics and education. So Uehiro, which is confusing because there is a Uehiro, UH kind of center here at UH as well, but that slightly different.
Yeah, I would pronounce it the Uehiro is how I was pronouncing it in my mind all the time. It's funny, some of those things that you come in contact with all the time, but I don't think I ever heard anybody actually say it. Well, anyways, Dr. Ben and I know each other. Obviously, I used to be at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. We were connected basically through dialogic pedagogy. Like, I was interested in talking circles. Dr. Ben is into it's called Philosophy for Children, P4C Hawaii, and so we'll get into that a little bit later. But one of the things we used to be a part of a writing group, and one of the things I always enjoyed, so when we did a writing group, it was like 2 hours long, and we tried to create community as well as push forward our writing and support each other that way. And so we were always talking about, Ben and I are both fathers, and we take our roles very seriously and enjoy the involvement with our children. So we were always talking about movies and TV shows and books for our kids, and it's been a while since we talked about it. And I remember one time we were talking about shows and movies, and I was telling you how disappointed I was with The Mandalorian. I'd watched the first episode, and you were like, "What? You're supposed to look, it's a great show." And I actually ended up finishing at least the first 2 seasons, and I enjoyed it. I thought it was a bit kind of redundant. The episodes were really action-packed and kind of the same things a lot of the time, but it was a good show. What have you been watching with your kids lately?
This is a good question because I got to figure out how much I'm willing to admit to. Right, my kids are both teenagers now, right? So tastes have changed. What was the thing? Again, I say this somewhat sheepishly, but we got caught up in that first season of Reacher on Amazon Prime.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if you've ever read any of those books or seen that. I should say first, it's not for kids, even though I'm sharing this as something I watch my kids. And the second season honestly got a little bit ridiculous. But that was something that we watched together. It's interesting, shifting from kind of like televised series to kind of like YouTube series, right? And so one of the things that I think we've discovered as a family together on YouTube is a channel called Oversimplified, and it's a history channel. A guy does little animated bits on episodes from history, big things like World War II, small things like the Emu War, and he does his research. It's really interesting and it's well done, but it's also kind of a big kid that produces it, and so they're funny. And so I think we'll watch Oversimplified. What is the other one that we kind of gosh, I can't remember his name. He does stuff on animals, and he's got like a disclaimer at the start of all of his videos, like this is not intended for children, nor is it intended for adults that don't want to be kids or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a very Lee Frank. No, that's not it. Oh man, I'm not gonna. Z Frank, Zefrank has fascinating stuff about animals. Like there's one about crows. It's just like blows your mind of what crows are capable of. But anyway, yeah. So those are some of the things that we'll get into now.
Yeah, that's cool. I think my kids would enjoy both of those. So thanks for the plug.
Again, both the oversimplified, totally PG. The Z Frank, not so much. So preview that first with your wife. Like, you know, you've got to have a certain sense of humor, I think, to kind of enjoy this. So yeah,
we'll check it out. My kids, I actually, you know, I think I have a different perspective than a lot of parents, and I view what's appropriate age-wise differently. I like talking to them about things, you know, and versus just like they're gonna get it at some point, anyways. But we're reading The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, and we're actually on the last book of the Return of the King. But it's so long, you know, and my kids are young, that we read a book in between each. You know, there's 2 books in each volume, and so we read a book in between. And we read the first book of his Dark Materials, The Northern Lights. Have you ever read that?
Yes. The Golden Compass series, right?
Yeah.
That is a fantastic series.
I had always kind of seen when the movie came out. And I've still never watched the movie, but I remember it coming out. I think I was just in that mid-range age, you know, where I wasn't sure what I wanted to do or what I was interested in. But reading the book, it was very interesting. And you know, I haven't gotten to the next 2 books, but I've looked into them and read the previews and whatnot. And it actually reminded me of Dark, you know, the TV show that we watched, just because of the multi-universe thing.
Yeah.
And so I'm interested to see where it goes from here.
And again, that's one of the things I would always recommend. I think it's really interesting, that first book. So my oldest had to read it for school at some point, and that got me back into it. And I reread all 3 like quickly because he brought it home. I was like, I reread it, had forgotten how good it was. But it gets, speaking of dark, like it gets dark. I mean, the thing that is unflinching about, you know, that kind of his Dark Materials series is he doesn't shy away from things that we would typically associate with adults, but are universal, like death, suffering, sacrifice, you know, just kind of absurdity of life, right? And I think like my oldest, he got to the end of the first book and there's this huge like gut punch right at the end of that first book. And he was just like, nope, I'm done. And I was like, no, it gets better. And then the next one and the next, you know, and he's like, but he was like, he was kind of still bent over from that gut punch and didn't want to kind of, and it does, and it gets even worse. So, I mean, better in my view, but I like from that sense. But yeah, he just came out with a new book. He's returning to that universe after like 17 years, and I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, I saw that it was I read something about that there was a new trilogy being released or something like that. And Jazz in the chat asked if we'd seen the series, and we're watching the season 1 right now. The problem with me watching stuff with the kids is I'm so tired these days at night. So they often watch it, and I end up falling asleep, and I'm disappointed because my favorite character by far in that first book was what the heck's his name? The Ioric Byronson, or however you say his name. I think I pronounce it wrong. One of those things where I pronounce it a little differently than they do in the show. But he's my favorite character. I really like how he did a really good job at making it like kind of humanizing a bear, but keeping it distinct from humans, you know. So he had his very own characteristics, and he didn't show affection, but he did in little ways, like just letting her put her hand on his head, which he wouldn't let anybody else touch him, and things like that. So I thought that was cool, and I think it's a good bridge. That series is a good bridge because you mentioned, you know, there's adult themes, but it's okay for kids. And I mentioned, you know, that I have kind of a different perspective, and I like talking to my kids about things, even if it seems it's a little over their head. I figure it plants the seed. and allows them to think about it. And I noticed that in the way they talk about things compared to some other kids, is that, you know, their ideas may be just a little bit deeper, things like that. But it reminds me of, we have a mutual friend, Aya, who just graduated with her PhD from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. But I was in a history of education class with Aya, and I'm a little bit like antisocial in some circumstances. You know, I have trouble with small talk and things like that. But Aya would sit next to me every day in class, and we would talk. And so I really appreciated that. And I was telling her about what I was interested in with, you know, my research and whatnot with talking circles. And she's like, oh my gosh, you've got to come with me to Waikiki Elementary, where we do philosophy for children, which P4C Hawaii, we can get into what all that means in a minute. But so I went with her to Waikiki Elementary, and so my experience as a kid in school in Utah was like the most traditional, by Western standards, Western traditional education. You know, like you weren't allowed to do pretty much anything. You went there, the teacher delivered the information to you. You had maybe worksheets and exams or quizzes to do. And that's basically what it consisted of. But when I went to that school, right off the bat, it was different. The whole environment was different. It was a more, I like the word casual. Like it seemed like the kids were more comfortable. The teacher, his name was Mr. Jordan. He was seemed really comfortable and casual in there. And something I probably never did other than to play like Duck, Duck, Goose or something in childhood is they sat in a circle and they had a little ball. And it was before Thanksgiving, so the topic was Thanksgiving. Yeah, so the topic was Thanksgiving. And these were, I think they were kindergartners, but I can't remember.
They were kindergartners.
For sure, kindergartners. So they're really young, so not used to talking about things. But it was really interesting to hear the questions and the ideas they had about Thanksgiving. And I think, you know, well, they're not going to understand everything right now, obviously, but they're planting that seed and they're, you know, jogging around these ideas that they may not have even thought about or considered until later in life. And that contrasts with my experience when I started teaching at the university level as an adjunct professor. And I just couldn't get, at first, I couldn't figure out why the students didn't want to participate in dialogue, or couldn't, or didn't want to, or were afraid, all of the above, unprepared. And it makes me, I've always had this link to where, like, you know, if kids were doing what they were doing in Mr. Jordan's class and progressively participating in dialogue, discussion, talking circles, P4C, whatever you want to call it, then they would be prepared when they got to college to talk and to share their thoughts, and they'd know that their experiences and the knowledge that they have is valuable and it can contribute. But they didn't know that. And so how did you get involved in you know, dialogic education, talking circles, philosophy for children?
I mean, there's a lot in what you said, I think, to build off of, and I think maybe we'll come back. Let's circle back to this idea of like dialogic environments, right? Because it's not just the practice, I think it's the environment. But I think to your question about like what got me into it, I think, you know, I've been interested in philosophy and in education kind of, you know, jointly for going way back. I mean, I was fortunate enough to take like philosophy courses when I was in high school and during the summer. And the thing I really enjoyed about those philosophy courses was the opportunity to kind of like share and think through like half thoughts, right? So that stuck with me. And then after undergrad, like I went and I was teaching and I was kind of doing a bunch of different teaching. I taught for a year in Moscow and liked it, but also kind of, it wasn't what I was going to do the rest. I thought like, oh, this is not quite it. So then I came here to graduate school at UH Manoa, and that's where I met who we call Dr. J, Thomas Jackson, right? The kind of person that really started P4C in Hawaii. P4C, by the way, for people that don't know, is like a worldwide movement that was started by Matthew Littman at the end of the 60s. If you Google P4C, people can learn a lot more about that movement out of Montclair State University. But Dr. J teaches a class every semester, Phil 492, in philosophy with children. And I took that class in spring of 2000. And I think things started to kind of fall into place and click together. And then I was fortunate enough to be hired as one of the kind of teaching assistants for Dr. J, right? We would go out and support teachers in the classrooms. And at this point, I think my interest is still largely in what he terms like big P philosophy. Like I love dialogue, I love talking, but I hadn't really thought that much about education. But I think as a teaching assistant, one of the things that we do is we're placed into the classrooms of, I think, exemplary teachers, right? And I remember going out to a teacher at Alawai, second grade teacher, I think it was, and sitting in her classroom for like the whole morning and just like really kind of being in awe of everything that she did, kind of all these little things, whether it was conscious or not, to create the environment such that when we did, those kids sat in a circle, it was mind-blowing, right? And so that was my kind of appreciation of, I think, like pedagogically or, as a teacher, way more is possible than I think I was aware of. And then I think that journey just continued, right? Like the more classes you get into, the more different types of teachers you see, I think you just start to appreciate the synthesis of kind of philosophy as a way of teaching and teaching as a way to do philosophy. I'm going to, if I can just pause one quick second, I'm going to close a door here, just if that's all right. One quick second.
If you're in the audience.
There we go. All right, and back. That was it.
I was just telling the audience that if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll open it up for some call-ins a little bit later. You were talking about environment. What does that environment look like, or what does that mean to you?
So I mean, one of the phrases we use often in P4C Hawaii is like an intellectually safe environment, right? And that maybe raises its own sense of like definitions. What do we mean and talking about? But I think one of the things that you saw in that kindergarten class, and it's easier when kids are younger and it gets harder and harder as we get older, is this idea to be able that we can kind of share our thoughts, connecting our kind of thinking and experience with questions and topics at hand. And people will first listen, right? They will take what we say as an actual invitation to think about it rather than kind of like jump down our throats. I mean, we say without judgment, but of course judgment's happening. Like when you think, you're making judgments, but it's not as if if people feel that they're always on the defensive, most people, not all, tend to be reluctant then to speak because it's tiring, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not in a rush, right? One of the phrases we say a lot is we're not in a rush because you can't, if you're piecing things together, right? Like if you watch that, or you finish reading The Golden Compass and you're processing the end of that book and you're trying to figure out, like, you're 10 years old and you're trying to figure out your experience with adults and your experience with other kids and your experience with death and friendship and all that stuff, and you're trying to make sense out of what, whatever the dad, Lord, whatever his name is, does at the end of that book. And I'm not going to spoil it for people, but like, you can't rush that. You can't say, thank you, I saw it in the chat, Azrael. But you can't rush that. You can't say, come up with a fully formed opinion on whether he ought to have done that or not, right? And if you ask somebody to do that, they're just going to kind of defer and shut down. So you have to have an environment where people feel like they can say, well, I think that was bad. How come? Well, it didn't seem, and then other people can say, well, what about this? Or whatever, and then it goes and it unfolds, but you're allowed to kind of be where you're at and you don't have to rush to the next, stage of your thinking, whatever that is. Mm-hmm. And as we get older and older, right, more and more barriers come in to our willingness to think with others. I mean, you'll see as kids get older, social dynamics come more and more into play, right? If I'm going to say something that might upset a friend or might cause somebody to not want to be a friend with me, in middle school, you'll see if I'm going to say something where people are going to think I'm weird, right? Because being weird is one of the worst things you can be in middle school, even though everybody's weird, right? You know, and then you get into high school, and then you've got people with really different experiences. And so if you start sharing your experiences, you're worried about being judged. And at university, now we're worried about failing. We're worried about not getting credit. We're worried about, you know, what if I don't find this interesting? Do I say that I don't find this interesting? Like, there's so many barriers that kind of accrue as we get older that prevent. And so part of creating that environment is to be aware and to give paths around those barriers, right? If somebody feels that anything they say is going to be subject to a grade, we have to intentionally say, okay, this is not about being graded, right? If they feel that what they're going to say is going to be used and judged by their peers in a class, we have to give them ways to participate that aren't as prone to peer judgment, help build connections. We might get into those things later, but we can't dive right in and, you know, I don't dive right in and ask people their views on, you know, kind of Hawaiian sovereignty, right? Mm-hmm. That's immediately people are going to stake a claim and be very defensive. But if, you know, we do what you did today, like, what was the last book you read, right? And people go around and share that. Like, what do you think was interesting about that? Like, now we're unfolding, right? And we're discovering, we're listening, and you can start to kind of create and to kind of create paths around, I think, those different barriers to thinking together that are all over. I mean, if you think about it, it's very few environments that we're in where we can think together with other people. And why are those so few? That's, I think, part of what I've really been thinking about for the past 20-some years.
Yeah, I can even connect that to this podcast, because sometimes, you know, I have international guests and they've told me, for example, that they're nervous about about coming on here and doing something like this. And then I always started off just by talking about something that's mutually interesting to us. And I've had multiple people reflect just how much that meant to them to make them feel comfortable, as how we just talked like we were normal people and there were no, you know, there were no big expectations. It was just, we're just talking about things. And then the other thing that made me think about that I wanted to ask you is, you know, what's the importance of modeling that to the children? You know, if you pose a question, what's the importance of answering it yourself first and modeling it so that they can see how they might do it themselves?
I think modeling is critically important. And I think there's several things that we're modeling, right? And that modeling in some sense goes both ways, I want to say, for, let's call ourselves adults, right? Mm-hmm. I think the first is that wonder, right? Just kind of going like, or like, oh wow, that was really interesting. Like that is perfectly acceptable, right? That's a good thing, right? So modeling the kind of joy in wonder. But really young kids experience that already, right? As we get older, like typically, like, you know, you've met our friend and colleague Chad Miller, like when he was teaching high school language arts, right? That's one of the things he would say is that confusion is to be celebrated. Like, you do a reflection in the class. Did you feel confused today? And if you had your thumb up, high five your neighbor, right? Because that was awesome. But shifting that point of like wonder, confusion, things get really complex in your head. Like, oh man, I don't know quite what I think. That's a good thing, right? So you model that. Like, but I think the other thing that you're modeling, and this is connected to wonder, is this kind of idea of a beginner's mind, that you're willing to go back to like, wait, why do I know that? Why do I think that way? Oh, maybe this, like, I can't tell you how many discussions I've had about Minecraft, right? I'm not really all that interested in Minecraft, right? Like, it's not something I spend time with. But one of the things that I think, and this comes from modeling from the kids too, one of the things that I do is that I can get back in, like, what's interesting about Minecraft to me? Like, what questions does it create in my mind? And I have to kind of like clear stuff away to find what's interesting or what those questions are. And I think we're modeling that as well for students. And a big part of that, just to add in one final thing, is listening, right? I think one of the things that we've noticed is that a lot of teachers have, obviously everybody has different personalities, different strengths, slightly different values. A lot of times the teachers, I think, where the classes are almost consistently the ones where the kids want to really think together deeply, are ones where there's a real strong model of listening, right? Not just thinking, like listening. Because then what emerges from there is they start to really much quicker build off each other. That idea of a beginner's mind and wonder, when you have many people talking, it's like, oh, and you see those kind of like sparks flash and connections happen. That's, I think, what makes that type of environment. So I think we're modeling all those things, right? Like I'm modeling listening and connecting. Yeah, wonder, beginner's mind, all the above.
Yeah. There's so many ways that we can go, but I thought let's try to paint a picture of what P4C Hawaii looks like.
Okay.
I know I did that a little bit when I was talking about Mr. Jordan, but you are you still doing it every week, Waimanalo?
Yep,
Or?
exactly. I spend 3 of my days of the week out at schools. Currently, I'm working with teachers at Waikiki Elementary, teachers at Waimanalo Elementary Intermediate, teachers at Kaelipulu Elementary, and teachers at Kailua High School.
And so, what does that look like when you go in, when you're going in there and you're facilitating P4C? What does that look like?
So, I think first of all, I'm not always facilitating, right? So part of our role, and I think part of P4C Hawaii, is the teacher is cultivating like teacher philosophers, right? They're the ones who are ultimately facilitating. That's the goal. I'm there in a support role as kind of philosopher in residence. So I would say more than half of the classes that I see, I'm not facilitating. But there are. Sometimes a teacher either feels like they're just beginning and they want to see more modeling, so I might facilitate. Maybe they just don't feel comfortable. There's some horrible backlight going on here. But sometimes then I do facilitate. What does it look like? We're always sitting in a circle, as you said. Always have a community ball. Every class, we could begin the year making that community ball, and that's an important part of the process. It's an important part of like creating that environment. It's not just, I think, a facilitation tool in terms of like, who gets to talk. I mean, that's part of it. It's a facilitation tool, the person, but the very process of creating it, in some sense, is what allows us to kind of lower or navigate paths around barriers, wherever they're at in terms of thinking together. And it gives me as a facilitator a ton of information about this group, this class, this community that I'm with. But okay, we've got a community ball, we're sitting in a circle. I almost always begin, like, a lot of thinking together is sharing attention, right? And we've all got different things going on. So for me, one of the early things is like, how do we bring our attention back together? You can't always just, flip a switch and you're focused together. So I usually do some activity. Sometimes it's send the ball around the circle with some kind of like warm-up question. Sometimes it's a game. Sometimes I can feel that we're focused and we're ready to go. But I'm trying to kind of get a sense of like, are we ready to think together? And, the kind of default activity is an inquiry kind of process that we call plain vanilla. It's not super important why we call it that. It's just more of like, it's kind of our default inquiry process. And typically, there might be some stimulus, right? Something that we've read, watched, or done. Maybe there was a field trip. But sometimes there isn't a stimulus. It's just, what questions do we have? What do we wonder about? people will write down questions, or people will say questions and the teacher will write them down. Those questions can get recorded in a bunch of different ways. We vote in some ways. There's a lot of different ways to vote. And then we talk about the question that has the most votes, and we get started. And at the end, we always take some time for some reflection and kind of evaluation of ourselves and evaluation of our community of inquiry. Like, that's the basic process. I say that. The next thing to say is that basic process, in some sense, is very rare. It's like, to switch analogies, like for people that know, like, American football, like a defense may have its like base defense, but it may be in its base defense only like 40% of the time. So, like, it may shift if we have other activities. I can easily spend a whole day, a whole session, 30, 40 minutes just playing kind of games, right? Kind of like thinking games and just having fun. We might do a bunch of different things, like that part of that. But again, I would say, if I had to boil it down, when I'm coming into a classroom, if I'm the one facilitating, I'm first looking at, okay, where's our community at today? Are we focused? Are we ready to think together? Are people listening to each other? Like, kind of where we at? Like, what kind of inquiry are we going to do today? Are we going to start with a question? Are we going to have kind of like really short inquiries? How sustained is it going to be? Like, how philosophical is it going to be? Meaning, like, are we going to probe into the things that we think are meaningful? Or do we want to keep it a bit lighter today and do some inquiry that's like fun, like best Thanksgiving dinner, right? But we're not going to get into like, why are some people thankful and other people aren't, kind of thing, right? Like, I don't know, but we'll gauge that. But we're always going to do reflection. So those four elements of like community, inquiry, philosophy, and reflection are always going to be a part of that process. But to what extent is shifts like class by class, week by week. Yeah.
One is, as someone who has been around for some time now, what are you seeing in the kids that participate over time?
Oh, I think you see some real big qualitative differences. I think there's a real openness to others and an appreciation for others as soon as they see that opportunity. So, like, I'll go back. I'm fortunate now, like, some kids I see now at the high school, and I've known them since kindergarten, right? And during the pandemic, there were a lot of years maybe we didn't do P4C, or they haven't had stuff. And you can kind of see for lack of a better word, the hardening that happens from being in kind of public education. But as soon as all of a sudden you get in a circle and you see that community ball come out, it's like, oh, a recognition of this is what we get to do. And I think you see that again. I should say I see that again and again in any context. That your opening question of, they recognize opportunities for thinking together in a much quicker and more natural way than most people do, who are still kind of like, wait, is this a debate? Am I being examined here? Am I being asked to defend? Like, they will, oh, okay. And so what that means is they're much more willing to kind of share relevant parts of their own experience and beliefs as they contribute to the thing that we're discussing, right? They're generally more genuine, they're often more genuine listeners, right? In terms of like trying to understand what another person is trying to communicate, right? Rather than just listening to the words that they're saying, like, what are they trying to communicate? I think these are the qualities that we see develop over time, right? You could attach words like empathy, you could attach, words like, critical thinking, you could attach words like, I think, good judgment, but I do have to just say, like, it doesn't mean that we're not cultivating angels, right? Like, life still happens. A lot of people are still dealing with, I think, very challenging home circumstances or life circumstances or other things that are going on. And so, like, I don't see P4C as some sort of kind of formula or process for like becoming the best whatever citizen. We're not trying to create, but whatever they are, whether it's some guy who's in a grunge, I don't know if they're grunge bands anymore, but who's in a band, you know, kind of mostly sober kind of thing, right? Then, but he recognized whether it's somebody who's, you know, at some, you know, kind of top tier 4-year university in an ultra competitive environment, right? Those two kind of people at maybe different ends of the social kind of spectrum would still be able to kind of find connection and think together. That's what I see.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that. I feel like breaking it down in other terms from what I see, and what I am kind of like on the vein of Paulo Freire in that the mainstream education, it dehumanizes. Not saying 100%, but it again, the banking model of education, like transaction-based education, to where teacher knows everything, the students don't know anything, they come in, they deliver the information. Well, that's dehumanizing because you're just a part of a cog, and your experience, your knowledge, your thoughts, your reflections, you're not encouraged to be curious, and so in a way it's dehumanizing. And then I look at like indigenous education, indigenous pedagogy, some stuff like talking circles, and what I've learned from many elders over the time is they often talk about becoming more fully human or going back to being more fully human. And that's what I see, and that's my experience within adult talking circles myself. And what I see happening through P4C is it gives people an opportunity to be curious, but it also gives them an opportunity to regain some of that humanity and know that and their worth, and it makes them a part of it, right? You become a part of it versus you know, a figure that's independent of the circle. You become a part of that circle and a part of the rest of it.
Yeah, and I think that's it. Is that if you can have particularly that orientation where you recognize those opportunities, whether it's a talking circle on a formal way or a talking circle, you find a group of 2 other people, and you can have a conversation at a bar, right? But if you can recognize that opportunity that it's being presented to you, right, that's to kind of, it sounds overly dramatic, but like reclaim or kind of like practice your humanity, right? I think that's what's fulfilling.
Yeah. Well, I see we have questions in the chat, and I know folks want to call in later. So if you are thinking about calling in, now would be the time to start thinking about it, and you can put in a request in a minute. And there's a couple questions in the chat. I'll get to them in just a minute. But I wanted to touch on something else that you mentioned about, you talked about how, P4C isn't a remedy. It's not going to fix everyone's problems or create angels. And then it makes me think, I work with adults, so I facilitate talking circles here, and it's typically with a majority, if not almost exclusively, Alaska Native, often non-traditional students. And sometimes, these students have been through things or they're going through things, and, within the talking circle, those issues come up, with problems, talking about trauma that they've gone through, things like that. And sometimes it takes more, like as the professor or the facilitator, I've got to step outside and we've got to talk, and we've got to make sure they're okay, provide them opportunity. And usually the group is very supportive as well as in the talking circle. But children are a little bit different dynamic, and so I wonder, do you ever have instances where a student shares something that, might be uncomfortable for us just because it's hard to hear things or deal with it, or things that, aren't necessarily related to philosophy, but the child's life that you have to deal with or
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And that's what you're opening up. And this is what honestly makes a lot of teachers really nervous. And I've had conversations with many teachers about this, because as soon as you start saying that it's part of what we're thinking about, you can bring in your own experiences and your own beliefs. You're opening the door for people to share some, I'll keep it PG, some really messed up things, right? At least from my perspective. And I think there's multiple layers to that, right? Like, this is part of why I'm in that support network, and the teacher is that the teacher and I might then talk afterwards, and the teacher has protocols that they have to kind of follow and follow up with, right? Particularly anything that really seriously sounds like abuse. And when I say seriously sounds like abuse, like recognizing that a lot of times things come up, and if you're just listening to the words, like the words may sound like something, but it's not. We use words all the time without being really clear about what they mean, right? And sometimes, particularly with young people, like we do things to get attention as well. So I think the one thing to recognize is you don't necessarily take everything at face value. That said, right, the real important thing about being a part of a school or a classroom community is that the teachers and other adults in there might know that kid a lot better. So there will be follow-ups. There will be things, but that's normal, I think, for hopefully any school, right? If they're alerted to some kind of I'm trying to think, abuse, right? They're gonna follow up. I think the thing that I focus on, and particularly I think with your question though, is the fact that what are the responses of other people in that circle, right? So I remembering a 5th grade discussion from many years ago. Kid was sharing a story about his uncle, and I'm not going to share the story. But honestly, every kid afterward went to that kid, that's messed up. That's not right, right? And so you saw him kind of go like, oh, like he had kind of kept that in, but to hear from other people, one, that's a comment is like, that's not right. I'm sorry you have to go through that. But 2, sometimes it's like, oh yeah, I have that happen too, right? Like that it might be a shared experience. Both of those things are powerful. One is when people tell you that what you think is not right is actually not right. And 2, that, okay, you're not alone in experiencing this, right? So I think from that aspect of it, I think it's incredibly empowering, right? It's not any quick answer. The systems that we have to address kind of injustice in families are not particularly just themselves at many times. So that adds a layer of complexity to the external. But within that community of inquiry, I think a person can be seen and heard and feel like they're understood. And I think that's critically important.
Yeah, shared humanity at a young age. I talked to, his name is Ilarion Merkuliev, and he's a Nunangan elder from Alaska. And he taught me a lot about talking circles. And when he facilitates a circle, he says there's no violent language allowed. And he'll go on to explain that even that violent language even means if somebody talks before you, then you don't you don't respond to what they say and talk about how you disagree with them. He would say that's violent language. And it makes me think about children, and we talked about the social issues, and there could be bullying, and kids got to uphold the status quo to stay popular and stay into things. Do you ever run into any situations where that comes out in the circle, where somebody is making fun of what someone else said or something along those lines? And I just wanted to add that I've facilitated like 1,000 talking circles with adults, and I have never had that occur.
Interesting.
They are almost always supportive. People may be quiet and reserved, but they are almost always supportive of each other, and it hasn't manifested in the adult circles. But kids are different, so I'm just curious of your experience with that.
No, I think it's fairly common. I think it's fairly common with young children because, look, we're all trying to figure out how we fit together anyway. And some of us get positive attention, or attention, full stop, even if it's negative, by being mean to others. And I think I think that happens frequently. First of all, you try to set up opportunities, activities, an environment that makes that less likely, right? If it's less boring, for example, or if if, you're not kind of serving up things that people may walk into some kind of jab, but sometimes it's unavoidable. And it's our responsibility as facilitators to keep the circle a place where everybody feels that they can participate. And sometimes that means that somebody is not ready, right? It may change up the activity, right? Like I'm thinking of some particular classrooms I've been in where it was just really unsafe. We had some really, I think, toxic behavior. And I know that word's overused, but what I mean is like people always cutting in over each other or like insulting, like almost every phrase that a child would say, somebody else would mutter something under their breath, and it was hugely offensive. Like, change it up. Like, do a game rather than try to do something that changes the dynamic in a fun way that we like doing. Or, you're working individually with that person, or you're trying to figure out, it is hard, and you're making tough decisions because we want everybody to be there, but sometimes it's really interesting. There'll be somebody who's just default seeking, in some sense, negative attention, and if they're out, maybe they got suspended, right? The class goes and they form, and then that person comes back into the circle. You see everybody's body language. You see the dialogue just shift. And we've got to find ways. I don't have any, I feel like I'm constantly struggling with this question of what is the best way. And I don't think there's anything, other than the fact that trying that kind of truism, which is, okay, try not to hold it personally against any of the kids, right? This is not working, right? Whatever this community, how can we make this work, right? If this person isn't going to be a part of this right now, the goal is to always get them to be a part of this community of inquiry in the future. How do we do that? Maybe they need extra sessions outside, right? What can we create, right? What can we create? But to resist the tendency to think, oh, this kid's no good. This kid's just not going to fit in. This kid doesn't belong here. I think that's a very common response within education, or I should say within schooling. But yeah, we have to really work hard to actively resist that because, this is where I think bringing more and more people in, I'm not the only facilitator, right? There's a counselor at the school or a behavior health specialist or another teacher that has had the environment where that student has been really successful and focused. So what was it about that, right? But yeah, no, I feel like I do a lot of, I feel like experimenting, troubleshooting, and it's not always successful. I'll be honest about that. But I feel like we're at least trying to make this a better community of inquiry. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it's kind of a paradox, right? Because I was really bullied for a time when I was a kid, and I was in a small town in Utah, and I just didn't fit into the status quo, basically. I was made fun of, and one of the kids that made fun of me the most, I ran into him as an adult, and we talked and became just kind of friends. But he told me about his childhood, and his dad talked to him the same way that he talked to me, basically. And so those kids that sometimes are the most difficult or challenging are the ones that can benefit the most from those things. So it's they deserve empathy too, but it can be hard.
Yeah. Particularly when it's a community, and that's the thing is because I've seen it go wrong the other way. Sometimes a teacher has that empathy and wants to really make, just take this example of your friend included, but doing so makes everybody else really uncomfortable in that circle. Nothing ever happens, right? And it doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help, in this example, your friend, and it doesn't help the other kids. But there are other solutions, like finding some other thing where he can find an environment where he can communicate in a different way, right? Because you're exactly right. Most of this is it's all learned behavior, or it's cultivated behavior, and it's not going to change unless an environment changes significantly. And sometimes just sitting in a circle is not enough to change that environment. There have to be other changes that happen for somebody to go like, oh, I don't have to be the way that so-and-so is. There has to be more, maybe explicit modeling, more, smaller group of people, right? Whatever is going on. But yeah.
Yeah, because, I had when you're talking about, the other kids being tensed up, I could totally visualize that, and feel that, how that, that dynamic. And so it's a hard thing to weigh out, right? You gotta
It is.
balance it out. Well, we have lots of questions in the chat, and the first one is actually Marin, and she's here to call in, so I'm going to let her just, if she wants to ask 2 questions, both the one in the chat and the one she's got here. Hi, Marin.
Can you guys hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Not sure why my camera's not working.
Well, we can hear you, so that's all right.
Okay. So for the question I asked in the chat, just like the topics that you have in just the circles of this type of teaching or environment, have you had any backlash from parents where topics come up and it goes home or it goes into other classrooms or with other students where they don't agree and it becomes an issue?
Yes, but I think this is maybe the corollary to that, is that it's far less likely than you would think for 2 main reasons. One, the kind of internal reason, which is typically as we engage in these types of inquiries, we recognize that we've developed a certain amount of trust, right? And so there's almost like an ethos of what's said in the circle stays in the circle, right? And surprise, surprise, most kids are not telling their parents everything. So in some sense, that's one of the reasons that it's less common. The other is that we're a part of a teacher's classroom, and there are a lot of times teachers that have things that they're really uncomfortable talking about. And everybody understands that, the kids, whether that's said explicitly or not. So I've been in some teachers, they really don't ever want topics such as God to come up, because they personally feel very uncomfortable when any discussion about religion comes up, or they become really uncomfortable when anything violence comes up. And so it's their classroom, it's our community, they are part of the community. If we can always put kind of boundaries on, okay, this has come up, but I don't feel very comfortable talking about this, I don't think it's going to be, and we can move past it, right? And I think what we do develop is a sensitivity towards what things that people really are going to feel very uncomfortable talking about, in a way that then would create the types of situations with parents, right? Because that's what usually happens, is that if a teacher is pushing an agenda, that's what creates the kind of problems that you're talking about. But what I say is, look, if the kids want to think about this together, we then have the next question of, do we want to think about it with them? And if a teacher says no, fine, right? But if we're willing, but what we always respond to is, no, this is a question that came up from the kids. It's never coming from us as facilitators, right? I'm not asking us to talk about religion. I'm not asking us to talk about, politics. I'm not asking, sex, politics, and religion, right? The 3 kind of no-go areas. These are not things I'm bringing up for discussion. These are things that have come up naturally from talking about something else. And we then might say, oh, we're not going to talk about that. Let's take sex, for example, right? A lot of teachers are really uncomfortable talking about sexuality or sex in a class discussion. Fair enough. Well, we don't have to go there. Not all of us are ready to talk about everything at any particular moment, and that's fine. So it does happen occasionally, but usually it's resolved by that kind of thing I said, is this is a question that came up from another student. we either talked about it, and this is what was said by the different students, or we didn't talk about it any further. And then usually the parent understands, oh, okay. Like the teacher's not trying to push any sort of agenda or any sort of like, and that kind of goes away. So I haven't had any, like Christian was saying, I haven't had any long-term things where a parent has said, I don't want my child doing P4C because I don't want them thinking about these things. Most of the time, like if something comes up, it's a misreporting of like, so-and-so said da-da-da in this class. I'm like, no. Actually, I have it here. Like, this is what was said, but this is the question. Oh, okay. And it kind of.
Do you think it would be different if you were in Mobile, Alabama?
I think people would be much more guarded because the social awareness of it would be bigger. So, I think coming back to your thing about like kind of violent language, I think there is we can kind of create a sensitivity towards and a recognition. We recognize it already. So how do we navigate around it? And you'll hear kids all the time say like, oh, I'm really, really sorry. I still like you, but I disagree. And they recognize that the disagreement may be perceived as a form of violence. But that's not their intent with it. They're just trying to say, like, I have a different perspective on this, right? But part of what that indicates is a social awareness of what's happening and how we relate to each other. And if part of that social awareness were embedded in these larger social awareness, these larger cultures, is that people might be more guarded about having to do more like preliminary work of saying like, I'm not saying this, like, like you might do more of like, I'm not trying to trigger any sort of, kind of response or like put you in a corner, but then they might still be able to talk about it. I think there would just be more kind of parameter defining in other contexts. I was asking a colleague in Florida, like, what's going on in Florida, and she said, no, we can still have discussions, but there just has to be a lot more sense of like, why are we having this discussion? If it ever feels like it's a teacher agenda, that's where you're in the most, I think, the highest risk situation.
You still there, Maren?
I am. It kind of is answering my second question of just how to harness this within, I guess some of my background is teaching and special ed, and my philosophy of teaching conflicted with teaching how it is in public education. And so just how to harness that growth and that education within teachers to be able to have this in their classroom, to be more comfortable, to just change and grow, I guess, within our education system.
That is the million-dollar question. And that's the question I feel like I'm actively kind of struggling with year in, year out, weekly, right? And I mean, to give a certain answer, let me put it this way. I think there are people and other teachers like you out there who value inquisitiveness, who value kind of wonder, who when they think about what is the purpose of education and they think about kind of cultivating these kind of dispositions or skills or the whole child, whatever that language is, are going to be kind of on the same wavelength, right? And finding those people, right, and thinking together with them is a key step. There's going to be then another phase of teachers who are interested in that, but are either realist or cynical and think, oh, that's just not possible. Like my role is to get kids prepared for this test, right? The state test, or to do A, B, and C. And as much as I would love to have, kind of philosophical inquiry, it's just not going to happen. There's no time, there's no space for it. It just can't work. And so those teachers like that, I think, are kind of tend to be maybe in the second wave. Like once you have the people who are like, no, I don't, that you're kind of maybe more idealists, right? That kind of are successful. So if you're meeting and you're at a school and you're having success, and what I mean by success is you notice the change in the kids, but you're also noticing some kind of academic or behavior changes as well. And this has been the story, I think, at the schools in Hawaii, is that then that becomes the examples that you point to for those others, like, no, you can do this, and you're not going to, in some sense, be guilty of not doing your job as a teacher. You can still teach to whatever standards you have. You can still have students do well, as well as they're going to be doing on their state testing, and you can do this, right? And if I figure if I can get those kind of two groups of people, then we're in good shape. I mean, people who, Christian mentioned Paulo Freire, like people who don't think of education as a kind of system of oppression, who are just like, yep, just toe the line, get your thing. And like, if people who don't want anything more out of education than just whatever the cookie cutter model is, and those are pretty few, but they're out there, I'm not worrying about them, right? If I can kind of reach the people who have a similar vision and are willing to experiment to that vision, and then from that, with success from that group, to those who have the vision but think that it's just not possible, those are the people that I'm looking to target, meaning in terms of like get involved in this bigger movement. I hope that, it's not, I can't give a full answer because again, I don't have it all figured out, obviously. P4C in Hawaii is still only in a relatively small number of schools, and there's teachers isolated. So the systemic problems are significant, but in ways that we have seen it be successful, those are the elements that I've kind of identified.
I just wanted to add one thing to that. Mention Freire. He has a book that's a dialogue with Miles Horton, and it's called "We Make the Road by Walking." And they talk about a lot of things, but the thesis of their argument, I think, is basically that you have to create this road by walking the path, and then you open it up for others. And that's how I view it for myself. I know I'm not changing the world per se, but just by facilitating talking circles, by opening it up to my students, it creates that path where they might be able to walk it easier in the future, and then more and more, kind of like rhizomatic patterns underground, unstoppable to some degree, maybe not changing everything, but changing it for some.
Yeah. And over time, things can change, definitely.
Well, thank you. This is an area of passion personally, just for many different reasons. So it's nice to see just this change, and it's happening in Hawaii, but hopefully maybe it can expand in other areas. I would love to see education change quicker, but we know it takes time. But thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Maren.
Thank you, Maren. Well, the call-in lines are still open if anyone's out there. We still got some questions in the chat to get to, so we'll get right to it. Jazz asks, what do you think about the theater environment for a place where these connections can get built? How do you feel about the role of creative arts in education, specifically young education?
I think they should go hand in hand. So we've had here at UH Manoa several Masters of Fine Art theses on P4C and theater for young audiences. One, a good kind of friend and colleague, is now in the Seattle area teaching, I think, at university, but also working with youth programs. He designed an entire show built around this kind of pedagogical kind of like P4C process in terms of script. So there was no he was it. So he called himself a facilitator. He wasn't the director. He wasn't a tutor. He didn't write it. It came from this thing, and it was pretty amazing. he wrote a blog post about it. Nate Drackett is his name. I'll give him a shout out. He wrote a blog post on Amber Makayao's kind of progressive philosophy and pedagogy blog, which I highly recommend for interested listeners. But yes, I think, and this is the key to this, is that, look, when we want to think together, right? Thinking together, I think, is kind of building our humanity, practicing our humanity, walking the road. That doesn't have to be through language, right? Some of us are just not great with language, right? Language is hard, right? Language is a really weird thing to take a thought and try to put it into words, and then to share words and concepts. So being able to think through shared actions, through creativity, through, like, there's lots of ways to share attention and think together rather than sitting around in a circle and talking, right? And so the more you bring in, I think, these creative arts into education, the more opportunities you're giving for people to experience this almost kind of shared attention to an inquiry process that's not just spoken dialogue. I got a lot more to say and a lot more other examples, but I'll keep it quick and say, people that do kind of P4C in the theater environment, the more you can incorporate theater and creative arts in education, the better it is probably for everybody. I mean, that's been one of the biggest victims of what started as the No Child Left Behind movement. And it continues to happen. But yeah, that's that's something I actually feel really strongly about, but I could launch into another kind of, I'm going to keep myself off the soapbox here. So
I also could speak from, my experience. I remember as a kid, I was super into theater and trying to act out plays, and it was stifled. I was shut down for the most part, and I have 3 young kids, and all 3 of them are interested, almost unsolicited, you know what I mean? They talk about it. They want to do puppet shows. They want to create plays. They want to create performances. And so from my personal experience, that it's naturally there for the kids. We just need to, provide the opportunity for them.
Yeah. And the fact that we don't, right? And the fact that we feel, anyway, yeah, I'm going to get off into a rant. I feel it coming. But is just part of what's ailing, I think, schooling and how we think about education.
All right, well, we've got Anna calling in, so let's get to her, and then we'll get to those other questions. Good morning, Anna.
Hey. Good morning.
Good to see you.
Sorry. It's good to see you too. I've got my 4-year-old off of my side, so it's kind of interesting. So my biggest thing was special education. I noticed that you hadn't really been talking about that, but my oldest is autistic and has ADHD, and a lot of that communication and body language is really difficult for him. So my biggest question would be how to instigate talking circles and be able to have that open communication without being too much. Yeah. Because with him, if you push too much for conversations, it's very difficult.
No, I honestly think special education is one of these areas where this kind of P4C approach, in some sense, should get a little bit more recognition. It's something I was just writing about recently. There's some kind of online thing through Kobe University, and the phrase that we've used here is like reshuffling the deck. P4C can kind of reshuffle the deck. And particularly in the US, a lot of like inclusion classrooms, I've seen it be extremely effective. I have lots of stories I could tell, but I think at the heart of it is being able to accept participation in whatever form it's going to be given, right? And being invited to participate. So whether that's, I've got students in some of my classes who are like nonverbal, right? They use like the tablet, like communication boards, right? But they still will consistently get invited, and their one-on-one aid helps them with that. Sometimes, whether it's sensory things, I have kids, like they'll sit for a bit and then they've got to step out. And we all know that, like, okay, fine. Like, you need like a little sensory break from all this kind of language being happened, like you step out and then you come back in. Or they have, you know, what all the other kind of adaptives that teachers are using. But I think one of the things with the community ball, and even this is a sensory thing, like I have some kids that refuse to touch it, like they don't, it just doesn't feel right. It's a little bit, and that's fine, like it can go, but they will continually be invited. And we build this up through different games, through different activities, so that even if their speech is not going to be understood, they are still invited to try to participate their speech, whether that comes from almost unintelligible articulation that we then work together to figure out what they're saying, or whether it's through like a communication board or a tablet or something like that. Or as we get older, right, and what you want to talk about is already like, particularly on the autistic spectrum, is like kind of those key interests. Like every time you get the ball, you know, you're going to talk about trains, for example, right? That's fine. Like nobody's, like we could totally pass it to, you know, Christian, knowing that he's going to talk about trains, even if we were talking about something else. Because that's part of what makes Christian Christian, is he's obsessed with trains. So part of, I think, what P4C does in creating this type of community of inquiry is create a certain just baseline acceptance of that's how so-and-so participates, right? I mean, I've got one young autistic boy in one of my classes who can't help, like, just he gets overstimulated really quickly and he's constantly like screaming out and vocalizing. But honestly, the others, now it's first grade. The first graders don't get ruffled by it. They're like, oh, it's just so-and-so screaming. And they like lock in and we're focused because that's, I'm not going to use his real name, obviously. That's just so-and-so screaming. That's just who he is. Like, it doesn't mean that he's trying to be disruptive. They recognize he's not necessarily in control of his reactions. And they still, when they get the ball or we pass it around, pass him the ball. And he's right there and he'll get up out of his seat, you know, and go and give somebody, like, go over to somebody and you don't know what's happening. We kind of just roll with it. And I think that, to me, is one of the most amazing things I think about P4C, is we just roll with it. And there's another great high school classroom where whenever the teacher does, she invites, so at the high school they have like a fully self-contained special education classroom, right? Many of the kids have one-on-ones. There's a high adult to student ratio, as you'd expect. But she invites that classroom to her Japanese language and culture class. And the way that they're integrated into this is Japanese, right? Like, they're struggling up with English, they're still kind of like, they're still going. But the brilliant thing about it is that Japanese is hard for everybody, right? So the fact that these students, whatever that participation is, what, are you rocking your introduction in Japanese? Do you know all your, no. So we're all kind of like, she says, we're all where we're at. And that environment kind of pervades that classroom. And sometimes, you know, yeah, I think we underestimate our ability to kind of recognize difference and just roll with it. We think that people aren't going to be able to get over it because we have other expectations in mind. But my experience has been, no, I think in the right types of environments, we can handle a huge kind of diversity. And yeah. I don't know, it's not, maybe I got a bunch of stories, but I'll leave that. I got something coming out soon that I'll refer you to, and you can read some of those stories.
That sounds great. Thank you. Besides that, I did have one more question. It was actually kind of brought up previously about the creativities in schools. Now, I've got a daughter that is very, very creative. She actually goes to school with colored hair because that helps her with her ability to branch out and communicate. And it definitely has an interesting dynamic because there's so many people that are surprised at the fact that she has colored hair.
Yeah.
But it definitely does help her. But she'll be going into 5th grade next year. And then after that, they're starting to switch 6th grade into middle school. And with that comes new rules.
Yep.
And I don't know how in the world to properly help her transition, because with middle school, you've got a lot of difficulties with,
Yep.
I don't even know how to say it myself. It's just harder. It really is.
And I think, the real tension here is trying to figure out this line between accountability, right, and acceptance. And as a parent of a middle schooler, like at that age of at the peer level, kids are struggling with acceptance. Not just feeling accepted, but accepting others who are different, right? At the adult teacher level, what you're seeing is all these differences, and you're trying to create a kind of, if not a homogeneous, at least a reliable learning environment, right? And part of that then is accountability. That's the word that's thrown around all the time. And accountability then often gets cashed out in kind of rule-following behaviors, right? Being, within a narrow bandwidth of kind of acceptable things. And I think most teachers are looking for accountability, but what gets heard at the teacher level is, okay, these things are not allowed. And then at the student level, right, we're trying to kind of like fit in. We want to be accepted, but we're also trying to carve out our places by constantly identifying people who are different. And I think where it often goes wrong is when there is no social awareness, right? Like, things can go really wrong, right? When there's no social awareness, we know that creates challenges and problems. When there's too much social awareness of like we're only thinking about what other people are thinking about, likewise it's that kind of like Goldilocks zone of enough social awareness where I'm willing to say, okay, I can't just do whatever I want, but not so much social awareness that I can only do what I think other people are going to accept. But how do we navigate that? I wish I had an answer, honestly, as a parent of a middle schooler. But I do think that's just part of this ongoing process. And your fears about middle school, in some sense, are completely justified. I don't think it's going to be a disaster, but it's going to be this like constant thing of like, she'll figure out like, how are teachers going to respond to colored hair? How are peers going to respond to colored hair? And particularly here in Hawaii, there's just a lot of things that kids are expressing in those years that both their peers and the teachers really don't know how to deal with. And I would say I'm not sure how to deal with, right? So, but I think these are the things that we're trying to navigate. Like, we can't give up on do whatever you want. Like, that's not what I want. I also don't want to be this, but yeah, I feel I don't have an answer, unfortunately.
That's all right. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Anna. All right, we got a couple more questions. This one from Simone is similar to the first one Anna asked, but maybe you can add a little more context or perspective. She says, my kids are autistic with ADHD and really struggle to know how to jump into conversations. I unschooled both And my daughter went to a part-time free school, and they had a talking circle, and my daughter loved it because she could be included, and she passed the ball around and given a turn. What is your experience with kids who process communication differently?
Again, I think it has to be a back and forth. I think, first of all, the first part of her question of like, struggle how to jump into conversations, we have to give multiple kind of entryways, like, you know, entry ramps, right? Like into conversation, right? It could be a shared prompt. It could be something, it could be like writing on your own, right? Like the teachers I see that are most successful give multiple things that kids can do. So, okay, if we're going to come up with a question, for example, it's okay if you're going to talk about it with your peers. If you want to just in your own thing like journal and write things out, great, right? If you want to come up and talk to a teacher or talk to another adult, fine. Like you can have multiple things at play at once, right? So that's the first thing, is to recognize that getting into talking with others is itself a challenge, and we have to be creative and open about how we do that. The next part is recognizing how communication is going to unfold, right? That people have different staminas with giving attention and how they listen, right? And whether that's people using like fidgets, and but let's take that example as like a case study, right? What's your experience with kids who process communication differently? It's always a balancing act. Because I might have a student who, again, like ADHD, and they have like in their chairs, they put these rubber bands at the bottom of their chair so that their legs have something to kind of like push up against. But if you've got a student there who's just constantly like twanging the rubber band on his chair, and so we're talking, and there's this constant twang, 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 right? Now we're in this balance point of like, okay, are we going to be able to get past this? Can we just ignore it and move past it? Because this kid is like, or is this a controllable behavior, right? Is this student going to be better off by recognizing that if he can learn to kind of control that will be easier, right? I don't know. Like in some sense, it's a constant feeling out. Like to share another, this is a very common example, I think, particularly with people that communicate differently. Some people, and you may even think I'm one of these people, like will store up a lot of thoughts. And so then when they get the ball, they will just unleash all of their thoughts at once, right? And we don't set timestamp. But if a kid has the ball and talks for like 5 solid minutes, right? Typically what happens is that other people kind of get impatient. Or they're like, okay, like there's 20 of us in this classroom and you've just taken 5 minutes sharing all of the thoughts that you stored. So what happens is that sometimes then that student doesn't get past the ball as often because everybody knows if we pass the ball to you, you're not going to just, take a minute or 30 seconds and share a perspective. You're going to unload for 5 or more minutes. So how do we balance that? Like, do we not pass the ball to the student because they need to kind of talk in a continuous stream of consciousness? We want them to be included. But it's that question, can they control it? And I'm thinking of a specific student from many years ago when she was in 4th grade. She was in that situation. And toward the end of the year, she wasn't getting the ball very often at all because the peers would recognize that was it. Like we might be like ideas back and forth, and then it would get to her, and it would just be like, phew, and she would talk kind of nonstop. But she was feeling hurt because she wasn't getting the ball. She was feeling hurt. They don't want to hurt her feelings. So how do we navigate that? How do we balance that? And in some sense, I was talking with her after, the teacher and I, like, why do you think that's happening? do you think it's because, and she was like, well, I don't think they like me. Oh, okay, I don't think that's the case. I don't think it's that they don't like you. But like, was she aware that she was talking at length? And initially she wasn't. And I think it started to form an awareness. So then in 5th grade, what you saw is she changed. Like, she recognized that she's got a ballooning set of thoughts in her mind. But in this particular environment, she was just going to share 1 or 2 of them and then pass the ball. And sure enough, she got the ball more frequently. And then I happened to kind of track her through middle school. And through middle school, she was honestly really adept, I think, at participating in these dialogues. But in some sense, we all are making compromises all the time, right? We have to find, if I have 20 thoughts, it doesn't mean just because we're in a circle that I always get to share all 20 of my thoughts, right? Because there's 20 other of us. We might all have 20 thoughts, and it's just not possible. So what is it that we can do in this circle together? And maybe we turn it into writing, or we turn it into something that. But to me, it's ultimately always going to be this balancing of what are we trying to do versus how is this person expressing? How much is changeable? How much is not? Should it be changed? Right? Because we definitely lose something when you can't share all 20 thoughts. We do lose something. But what do we gain instead? You're kind of, I think, constantly, we should be, as a community, constantly examining these trade-offs. And I think that's the challenge, is to not make a rule, hard and fast rule, but to constantly be revisiting what are we doing for these differences in communication and differences in behavior. How are we accommodating them? How are people included? How are we still thinking together? Yeah.
Yeah, I love that conversation, and it makes me even just think of my own. I have 3 children, 4, 6, and 7 right now, and my youngest is just the student that you're describing. She's only 4, but she likes to talk. She got a lot of ideas, and so we have talking circles in our family. We try to do them every day, but sometimes we're tired and we don't get them done. But same thing, I have to figure out ways to allow her to talk and share freely without being hindered, but also not irritate the other kids because she talks for 30 minutes.
Exactly.
And oftentimes, I don't mean to say about nothing, but kind of sometimes it's just,
and
stuff.
And then.
Yeah. And it also makes me empathize with her and other kids, because that kid could be in a similar situation. Maybe she got a lot of older siblings and never has a chance to talk, and so they want to take full advantage of the opportunity. Yeah. And in some ways, there's nothing wrong with that, but we do have time, right?
Yeah.
And that's another thing that I come in with, another issue that I experience, because the way I was taught talking circles was from Alaskan Native folks, elders, and they would say that, talking circles aren't a thing that fits into time. Yeah. You got to let people talk. How are you going to tell somebody that they only have 3 minutes when their heart is burdened and they need to unburden it in order to think clearly? And so I remember just a couple things. I remember when I first participated in the talking circles, I didn't like them at all because I felt like it took forever and people were talking about all their problems, and I got homework to do and I'm hungry, all these things. And so it took me time, for it to settle itself and become transformative for me. I lost my train of thought. Okay. So I teach it's called the Bachelors of Social Work Rural Cohort, and we have students that come in from all over this. Alaska's gigantic, so they're flying in from thousands of miles away, and we have talking circles in person, and then we do them in Zoom in between. But the biggest difference I noticed from, and it's not exclusively this way, but for the most part, my indigenous students, especially like non-traditional with life experience and whatnot, versus the regular, Western type of mind-thinking students, is that the Western students, when it's class ends at 10, and excuse me, this isn't everyone, this is just most of them.
Exactly.
Class ends at 10, it's time to go. But the indigenous students in my cohort, they don't complain at all, and if class ends at 6:30 p.m., but we still have 3 or 4 folks left to go, it doesn't matter. Nobody complains, everybody stays. And I'm often thinking that, when somebody's talking for a long time and the end of class is coming up, I'm thinking everyone's going to be anxious and start complaining. But they don't. They respect it and they look out for each other. And those folks listen to them and they sit there and pay attention, actively listen. And so I think that obviously there's different paradigms in the way that folks look at the world and perceive the world, life experience. But I think that's something that can be built, and I can speak from myself, personal experience, You participate in those things and you build that capacity to exist in that space without having something else that you need to do that's more important. And it goes back to the conversation we have about being a part of it instead of some separate entity.
1 second. I got a class coming. I got to figure out how to. Sorry about that. I have to get going here, but I'll just add in one last thing, and I think this is one of the big tensions here is that, like, I used to talk about philosophy, like what makes somebody a philosopher. A philosopher is somebody who takes time, right? Who makes time for things that, like most people in a rush, that stops and just thinks. And so the real question is, are talking circles and schooling just incompatible? Are those two things that will never fit together precisely because of the different attitude about time that you indicated, right? The different structures of time. And I wouldn't fault somebody that said they are completely incompatible, right? But my kind of ongoing hope is that, no, I think, yes, it's not going to be, you're maybe not going to be satisfied. It's not going to be the true thing that you might get from a talking circle where time is somewhat irrelevant. But there's still something there to introduce a certain kind of not being in a rush in a highly time-oriented environment where the lunch bell still rings, we still got recess, we still got, a very limited amount of time. I think there is a productive struggle in that, and a useful struggle, right? But I think that tension will always be there. And I think that it's better to kind of embrace the tension in the way that, like, these may not fit together, but let's keep trying to put them together, rather than to say, nope, we can't do this in schools. And I've lots of good friends and colleagues that would say that, nope, schools are just fundamentally broken and we can't do anything. I'm not sure that's true yet. So that'll be my closing thought, because speaking of time, I've got students who are who are also waiting.
Okay, Dr. Ben, before you go, I just wanted to say, deep thank you from the bottom of my heart. I really respect you. I've always appreciated your friendship and the way that you were able to mentor me. I can't thank you enough, and I hope that we don't go so long before speaking again. I'll be there soon. I'll reach out to you. I'll be there for a little bit, so I'll try to connect with you.
No, thank you, Christian. Thanks for creating this opportunity. Really enjoyed it today. Really appreciate the questions from your students, and really happy to see you doing such great things up in Alaska. So, yeah, it won't be long.
All right, Dr. Ben, have a great day.
You too. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye. Bye. And then Annie, I'm sorry we didn't get to your question. We were running out of time, but I'm gonna go ahead and try to address it myself. It says, I am the oldest of 4 girls, and my youngest sister has developmental delays. I'm the only one who went to public school throughout school, while my other sisters were all homeschooled. While I think that there are pros and cons to both sides of education, how do I know which is best for sending my kiddos to school? My oldest is 5 and will be starting kindergarten this fall, and I worry that public school may feel her creative and whimsical side by not allowing her to be her unique self. And I think that's a great question, and I think it's almost impossible to answer definitively. I had a terrible experience as a kid going to school, and so as a response to that, I homeschool my kids right now. But I'm also reserved about that because they miss out on social aspects of things, and they don't have as many friends as some kids. And I worry about, what kind of teacher will they have? Or same things with you. Will they stifle them? Will they stifle the curiosity that they have that I've tried to manifest in them? And I just think that there's no great answer for it. I think that there could be, and not everybody has the capacity to homeschool either. You know, some people have to be at work, different situations. And every school is different. Every teacher is different. And so my advice would just be as assertive as possible and not accept anything that you don't believe in. Know that you can, there's a saying, there's the serenity prayer that a lot of people use in recovery, but an old mentor of mine, Angela Davis, says it a different way. And she says, I'm no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I'm changing the things I cannot accept. So my advice or my reflection would be that, don't accept anything, don't accept anything that you think needs to be changed, especially when it comes to your children. And you always have some power or leverage. And, I even I have a friend of mine who has an autistic child, and she felt that the school wasn't giving them the care and the attention that they needed. And she was really assertive and pushed them and pushed them and pushed them. And then finally, they listened to her and they created a plan. I don't know exactly what happened, but they created some kind of a better plan. And her son was able to get more of the care and attention that he needed. So I'm sorry that I'm sorry that we didn't get that question to Dr. Ben, and I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you. But I would say empower yourself and know that you can make a difference and you can change things that you don't accept. All right, everybody. It was a pleasure talking to Dr. Ben, and I'm very pleased with all the questions and the interactions we got from the audience. Take care, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Peace. This episode was recorded live on Monday, March 4th, 2024. It featured Dr. Benjamin Lukey and was hosted by Christian Ace Stettler. Brought to you by the University of Alaska Fairbanks Department of Social Work, this has been a Conscious Party production. You've been listening to The Critical Social Worker, a revolutionary storytelling podcast. Your story, my story, our story. All right, everyone, until next time. Keep being revolutionary. Peace.